Simon Ekpa appeared in court on June 13, 2025, 2 days after a previous hearing on June 11, where 3 members of the indigenous people of Biafra, ipob, testified against him. Their testimonies were accepted into evidence, surprising the presiding judge due to IPOB's terrorist designation in Nigeria. During the June 13th session, witnesses from Enugu State, Nigeria, appeared to testify, reportedly sent by the Enugu state government, which had earlier pledged to provide evidence against Simon Ekpa to the Finnish government. The witnesses referred to a 2023 article by the Finnish media outlet Yle, which documented how Simon Ekpa's sit-at-home orders caused entire cities in southeastern Nigeria to shut down every Monday, with people too afraid to go out. One witness interviewed by Yle in 2023 appeared in court, stating that their mother died because she failed to obey a sit-at-home order, highlighting the extreme consequences of disobedience in the region. In court, this witness testified that Simon Ekpa's social media posts incited fear, leading to business closures, school disruptions, and even voter suppression during Nigeria's general elections due to widespread intimidation. The witness declared that Simon Ekpa's influence extended across 5 states, disrupting normal life every Monday. He blamed Simon Ekpa's commands for economic loss, educational setbacks, hospital inaccessibility, and even deaths. The prosecuting lawyer presented Simon Ekpa's own public statements, where he allegedly admitted to leading IPOB and encouraging sit-at-home orders weekly, using them as key evidence against him. Under cross-examination, the witness said Simon Ekpa communicated through social media platforms like Facebook and X, and that his instructions caused people to obey out of fear and pressure, with armed enforcers allegedly ensuring compliance. When Simon Ekpa was allowed to respond, he categorically denied all accusations, stating he never formally led IPOB, never gave direct orders, and that his public posts were only expressions of personal belief under freedom of speech. Simon Ekpa emphasized that the prosecution oversimplified a complex situation, arguing that people's decisions were based on many factors beyond his influence, and he should not be held solely responsible for the social and political unrest in southeastern Nigeria. Simon Ekpa delivered a personal speech in court, stating that he only expressed his political beliefs within the bounds of free speech. He denied being responsible for the actions of others and rejected the prosecution's attempt to blame him for any disruption caused by his words. The prosecuting lawyer strongly countered Simon Ekpa's speech, arguing that Simon Ekpa's social media posts and public pronouncements clearly incited fear, disruption, and economic hardship in southeastern Nigeria, regardless of his claims of non-responsibility. The prosecutor emphasized that Simon Ekpa's influence was undeniable, stating that although Simon Ekpa claimed not to be a leader, his words were consistently followed, leading to the closure of businesses, shutdown of schools, and general disruption across the region. Simon Ekpa was then cross-examined directly by the prosecution, and during questioning, he admitted to giving interviews and posting sit-at-home directives, but insisted he only encouraged solidarity and never forced anyone to comply. The prosecution challenged Simon Ekpa's claim of voluntary compliance, arguing that many people were intimidated and felt coerced into obeying the sit-at-home orders due to fear of violence, implying Simon Ekpa created an atmosphere of social pressure and fear. The prosecuting lawyer accused Simon Ekpa of using social media as a weapon, holding him accountable for the consequences of his words, and stating that Simon Ekpa cannot hide behind advocacy while his speech causes real-world harm. Simon Ekpa maintained that he stood by his beliefs and never intended harm, but acknowledged he could not control how others reacted to his statements, repeatedly denying responsibility for the resulting disruptions. The defense lawyer stepped in after the cross-examination, accusing the prosecution of oversimplifying a complex socio-political situation and unfairly portraying Simon Ekpa as a mastermind of regional chaos based on selectively quoted statements. Simon Ekpa's lawyer argued that his client merely expressed opinions and support, not direct orders, and that the actions of individuals were based on broader historical and political motivations, not Simon Ekpa's posts alone. On the morning of June 13th in the year 2025, inside a courtroom in Finland, where fluorescent lights hummed softly and wooden panels echoed the tension that filled the air, a man named Simon Nyoku Ekpa sat with a look of disbelief etched deeply into his face. The gravity of the situation unfolding around him could be felt by everyone present. It was not just another hearing. This was a significant moment in a long, controversial, and politically explosive case. For many months, Simon Nyoku Ekpa, a man who had risen to prominence through his vocal activism, particularly through his controversial involvement with the indigenous people of Biafra, was now seated not as an online firebrand, but as a defendant in a foreign courtroom, facing real-world consequences for his digital declarations. This particular hearing followed another held just 2 days earlier on June 11th, a session that had already shaken the courtroom. In that earlier appearance, 3 individuals who identified themselves as former members of the indigenous people of Biafra testified against Simon Nyoku Ekpa. Their testimonies were a major development because the indigenous people of Biafra is a group labeled as a terrorist organization by the Nigerian government. That classification alone made their participation unexpected. However, what stunned the Finnish court even more was the decision of the presiding judge to allow those testimonies into evidence. It was a turning point, one that signaled that the court was willing to look beyond labels and affiliations to examine the substance of what these individuals were saying. Now, on this fresh morning of June 13th, as sunlight streamed faintly through the courtroom windows and journalists prepared their notepads with hushed anticipation, another chapter in this complex narrative was about to unfold. Witnesses from Nigeria had made the long journey to Finland. These were not ordinary citizens. They had reportedly been sent by the government of Enugu state, a southeastern region in Nigeria, directly affected by the political turmoil surrounding the indigenous people of Biafra and the powerful influence of Simon Nyoku Ekpa's messages. The presence of these witnesses marked a turning point in the case, not only because of what they might say, but because of what their participation symbolized. This was no longer a case that existed purely in legal terms or confined within the borders of Finland. It was now a global concern, one that bridged continents, languages, and ideologies. It was now clear that the government of Enugu state in Nigeria was determined to hold Simon Nyoku Ekpa accountable for the consequences of his influence, and they were willing to cooperate with international authorities to do so. Among the witnesses was a woman who had appeared in a 2023 investigative report published by Yleis Radio Oy, the national public broadcasting company of Finland, more commonly referred to as YLE. The article had made headlines at the time. It explored the impact of the now infamous sit-at-home orders that were regularly issued from the safety of Simon Nyoku Ekpa's residence in Finland, through social media posts that traveled across the Atlantic Ocean and settled like heavy clouds over the towns and cities of southeastern Nigeria. In her court testimony, the woman recounted a tragic and deeply personal story. Her voice wavered but did not break as she told the court about the day her mother died. She described how her mother, an elderly woman with a fragile body and a resilient spirit, had fallen gravely ill on a Monday morning, one of the designated sit-at-home days. Despite the urgency of the situation, the streets outside were empty, paralyzed by fear. Shops were closed, taxis were unavailable, hospitals were unreachable. The woman said she was too afraid to venture outside with her mother because rumors of violent enforcement squads patrolling the streets made the risk too high. Her mother died later that day. The witness stated with quiet grief and unmistakable determination that her mother's death was not due to illness alone, but due to the atmosphere of fear that Simon Nyoku Ekpa had helped to create from a world away. As she testified, the courtroom was silent. Not even the scratch of a pen could be heard. Every individual present seemed to understand that this was more than a legal claim. It was a human cry for justice. The prosecuting lawyer took this moment to connect the dots for the court. Holding up printed screenshots of Simon Nyoku Ekpa's social media posts, the lawyer pointed out how his calls for weekly sit-at-home actions had not only spread widely, but had also been obeyed with frightening consistency. These posts, the prosecutor argued, had essentially become commands, not mere expressions of opinion. The prosecutor argued that Simon Nyoku Ekpa's words were more than personal reflections. They were directives that triggered widespread shutdowns across the southeastern region of Nigeria. Schools closed, markets remained locked, hospitals, public transportation, and polling units all stayed dormant on Mondays. The lawyer explained that Simon Nyoku Ekpa's influence, though broadcast from a faraway land, extended over 5 Nigerian states like an invisible hand, tightening its grip on the daily lives of millions. Another witness, a young teacher from Enugu state, testified next. His voice was stronger, more animated, filled with frustration that had clearly simmered for years. He told the court how the sit-at-home orders disrupted academic calendars, caused the cancellation of critical school exams, and even delayed university admissions for thousands of students. He said teachers feared going to work. Parents feared sending their children to school. Fear had become institutionalized, he said, and Simon Nyoku Ekpa's online presence had played a significant role in fueling that fear. The witness added that local businesses suffered major losses. Many people who relied on daily earnings to survive could not work on those days. Restaurants, motorbike drivers, roadside vendors, all had their lives turned upside down. He explained that it was not just a matter of political protest or solidarity. It was a forced stillness, enforced by the looming threat of violence from unidentified armed individuals who were rumored to be acting on behalf of the directives they saw online. Though Simon Nyoku Ekpa had never publicly claimed these individuals, the witness argued that his posts provided the moral justification for their actions. Simon Nyoku Ekpa's defense team requested to respond, and the judge allowed it. Simon Nyoku Ekpa, dressed in a navy blue suit with a crimson tie that seemed symbolic of the seriousness of the moment, stood up and addressed the courtroom himself. He spoke calmly, but with unmistakable intensity. He said that he had never issued a direct order to anyone. He claimed that his social media posts were protected by the right to freedom of expression and that he had never advocated for violence. Simon Nyoku Ekpa argued that he merely represented the frustration of his people, the pain of the southeastern Nigerian communities who had for decades felt marginalized and abandoned. He said that if his words resonated with many, it was because they expressed what millions already felt, not because he forced anyone to obey him. He denied ever being the official leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, despite what others claimed. He insisted that he had no organizational control, no chain of command, and certainly no enforcers acting on his behalf. He said that the Nigerian government's attempt to blame him for every act of civil disobedience or unrest in southeastern Nigeria was not only unfair, it was dishonest. The prosecutor stood again and countered, stating that the issue was not about direct orders, but about the power of influence. The prosecutor likened Simon Ekpa to a spark in a dry forest. His words, even if spoken as personal beliefs, ignited reactions that were both predictable and deadly. The lawyer pointed to the fact that every time Simon Ekpa made a sit-at-home post, a pattern followed. Cities shut down, people stayed indoors, and in many instances, violence occurred. Under cross-examination, Simon Ekpa was asked if he acknowledged that his posts had consequences. He responded that while his statements might have inspired some people, he could not be held responsible for their actions. He said he had no control over what others did in his name. When asked whether he ever considered stopping the posts, given the damage they allegedly caused, he said it would have been a betrayal of his political beliefs and his right to speak out. The prosecutor pressed further, asking whether Simon Ekpa had ever condemned the violence associated with the enforcement of sit-at-home orders. Simon Ekpa hesitated. He then said that he had always advocated for non-violence, but admitted that in the heat of political conflict, messages can sometimes be misunderstood. He again emphasized that he did not condone violence, but would not be silenced in the face of what he described as oppression. At this point, his defense lawyer, a Finnish woman with a sharp voice and a clear command of international law, rose to challenge the narrative put forward by the prosecution. She argued that Simon Ekpa was being used as a scapegoat for deeper issues in Nigeria, issues of marginalization, state violence, economic disparity, and historical grievances. She said that her client was a symbol of resistance, not a commander of chaos. She pointed out that Nigeria's own government had failed to provide adequate security in the southeastern region, allowing vigilante justice and mob rule to thrive. She claimed that blaming Simon Ekpa for every social and political problem was intellectually lazy and legally dangerous. She said that holding someone legally responsible for the speech of others, especially when spoken from a country that values free expression, was a slippery slope. The courtroom once again settled into quiet contemplation. Reporters scribbled furiously. Observers whispered. The judge looked both contemplative and cautious. As the day's proceedings concluded, there was no final ruling, no verdict rendered. But the impact of the day's testimony was profound. The emotional weight of the witnesses' stories, the philosophical and legal arguments surrounding freedom of speech, and the broader implications for international law and political dissent left everyone with much to consider. What lay ahead for Simon Ekpa was unclear, but what had become painfully obvious was that his voice, whether seen as a call to action or a spark for destruction, had reached far beyond the bounds of digital platforms. It had touched lives, reshaped societies, and now stood trial in a courtroom far from home. And in that courtroom, the world was watching. As the courtroom lights dimmed slightly that late afternoon on June 13th, in the city of Lahti, Finland, murmurs echoed through the gallery. The public, press and legal observers from both Nigeria and Europe remained seated longer than expected, reluctant to leave the charged air that had built up over the course of the day. Simon Ekpa, still seated at the defense table, appeared more subdued than usual. The storm of testimonies and cross-examinations had clearly weighed on him, not only as a political figure, but as a man whose name was now entangled with narratives of pain, loss, and conflict that stretched thousands of miles away in his homeland. In the minutes following the court's adjournment, legal analysts present began offering real-time interpretations to media outlets broadcasting outside the courthouse. Some believed that the testimonies delivered that day by the Enugu state witnesses marked a significant shift in momentum against Simon Ekpa. The case of Simon Ekpa had become more than just a trial. It had become a mirror reflecting the troubled relationship between digital activism, political speech, and accountability in a deeply divided world. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.